Hello, and thank you for joining us for this presentation presented by myself, Cherie Blanchett, and my colleague, Amy Wells. We're going to talk about the Kansas School Mental Health Professional Development Coaching System. The learning targets for this session are to identify the need for trauma-responsive, cross-system school mental health processes and practices, identify the building blocks around which systems can align to improve mental health outcomes for children and youth, to articulate the why, who, what, how, when, and where of implementing the school mental health professional development and coaching system, and describe the application of the school mental health implementation process. So we're going to begin about talking about the need for the implementation of cross-system, trauma-responsive school mental health processes and practices. By now, hopefully, most of you are aware of the groundbreaking study known as the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And if not, I'm going to share a little bit about it because it really is key to understanding the need for cross-system school mental health processes and practices. So the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study was conducted by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Kaiser Permanente. Kaiser Permanente. It's one of the largest investigations to date on the relationship between childhood abuse and neglect and later life well-being outcomes in both physical and mental health. What they learned was that adverse childhood experiences are common. Almost 2/3 of study participants reported at least one adverse childhood experience, and 1 in 5 adults report having had 3 or more adverse experiences as children or youth. Now, the original study included emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence, household substance abuse, mental illness in the home, a parent, usually a mother, treated violently, parental separation, divorce, or even just the incarceration of a household member, as well as emotional and physical neglect. Studies have shown that as a result of adverse childhood experiences, children are at an increased risk of low grades, failing courses, absenteeism, suspension, expulsion, low graduation, and even suicide. It's also worth noting that there's a bit of a domino effect in that caregivers of children and youth impacted by ACEs, the acronym for adverse childhood experiences, face certain risks as well. We use the term caregivers to refer to, yes, family, which could be extended family. It could just be whoever's taking care of a child at home, a child or a youth. But it also includes our educators, our mental health professionals and support staff. All those individuals who work with highly traumatized children and youth are at risk of experiencing toxic stress, which is when the stress response system is activated for an extended length of time without proper support. Secondary traumatic stress, emotional distress from exposure to the traumatic experiences of another. Vicarious trauma, which is the cumulative effect that results in the negative changes of the view of ourselves, of others, of the world. Compassion fatigue, which is just that decreased concern for others, where we're just tired. And we can't really just take on and support others. We can barely support ourselves. And then burnout, which doesn't even have to be related to trauma necessarily, but it is severe fatigue, work-related stress. All of this probably resonates a little bit just given this past year that we've had together through the pandemic. I think a lot of us have experienced some of those symptoms, at least on a continuum. So you don't need to be a brain scientist to know that children and youth spend a majority of their time at school. And so it's perhaps not surprising then that schools have become the de facto mental health system. Several studies indicate that schools are the de facto mental health system for children and youth. key findings from these studies include statistics such as 20% of children and youth have a clearly identified need for mental health services, but only about a third of them receive help. Of the children and youth who do receive mental health services, over 70% of them receive them from their school. This need is the needs resulting from this have surfaced in a number of ways. Now, here in Kansas, there was a report conducted by the University of Kansas, KU, Rock Chalk Jayhawks, and they identified areas of need to improve school mental health processes and practices, including access to and consistency across services, relationships with families, mental health training, mental reduction and stigma, and professional development on topics such as trauma, mental health disorders, behavior management, and specialized skill training. So, okay, what exactly are we talking about when we say school mental health? School mental health is defined as encompassing all aspects of social emotional development, including mental health, mental illness, substance abuse, and the impact of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. Practices that support the emotional well-being of all children and youth, including those at risk of or that have mental health challenges, as well as the supports and coordination thereof, provided by both school and community mental health professionals that address barriers to learning and growing healthy development. So there is a bit of silver lining here that we can grab onto. Studies show that children and youth are 6 times more likely to complete evidence-based treatment when it's provided in schools than in other community settings. Additional benefits of comprehensive school mental health processes and practices include academic and psychosocial outcomes, access to care, early identification and intervention, positive school climate and safety, children, youth, family, educator, peer engagement, and a continuum of services. Given the significant number of children and youth impacted by ACEs, it is essential that all aspects of school mental health processes and practices be trauma responsive. And the objectives of this grant are to build a capacity to implement a structured process to recognize, assess, identify, and respond to children and youth who are at risk of mental health difficulties and emergencies, to implement evidence-based multi-tiered trauma responsive mental health supports with, of course, Fidelity, to utilize data to inform decisions about the needs of children and youth, and to develop resources, protocols, processes for professional learning to sustain the implementation of tiered mental health supports. Traditionally, the practices of schools and community organizations that serve children and youth separately have resulted in inconsistent delivery of services and gaps for some of those children that are most at risk. So the ISF, Interconnected Systems Framework, which emerged from positive behavior intervention supports built upon implementation science, provides a structure for doing this as well. And the key messages are: implement a single system of delivery, whereby education and community partners leverage cross-system data and multidisciplinary teams to implement a continuum of evidence-based services and practices. Mental health is for all. Whereby a continuum of supports provides wellness for all with the same level of attention and concern as cognitive development and academic achievement. Access is not enough. Historically, school mental health programs have focused on counting the number of children and youth referred to mental health services as a measure of effectiveness, but access is not an intervention. Systems must move from access to outcomes as determining their measure of impact. And the final key message is that a multi-tier system of support is essential to installing school mental health because of that coordinated implementation with a representative leadership team, the use of data to guide decisions, cross-system data, formal processes for getting children the supports that they need, early access, progress monitoring, and professional development that's ongoing, both at the systems level and practices level. So individuals, but also the systems have to change. So I mentioned earlier those core principles, that are trauma responsive. that really should be reflected throughout the process and anything that's being implemented. That includes ensuring emotional and physical safety. So that commitment to establish physically and emotionally safe learning communities. The belief that healing happens in relationships. We say this all the time. It's always about the relationship, but we've not pushed our systems to focus on that. It's still about, numbers or what have you. But without that relationship, we can't get to those numbers. So commitment to developing safe, authentic relationships, viewing children and youth holistically, so their emotional, physical, and psychological well-being, the interconnectedness of it. A commitment to striving for cultural competence and respecting the diversity of our communities. Supporting choice, control, and empowerment. So self-determination and building that from an early age. Understanding trauma and its impact, and then doing something about it. And utilizing a collaborative approach. We can't go this alone. Children don't live in isolation or across environments. So we must be supporting them across environments. And that means we have to come together and work together, not in silos. Where and how to begin aligning system efforts. While there's no better base for an effective tier 3 than an effective tier 1, when aligning cross-system efforts, it can be helpful to begin at tier 3 because that's where a lot of our community partners they're set up to serve those children who are already needing intensive support. That's where their funding is, and that's currently how they're designed. So ultimately, while the goal is to align efforts across tiers, it can be helpful to start there at tier 3.
Thank you, Cherie. Thank you for describing this objective too. So at the end of this, yes, we want to be able to have you articulate the what, the why, the how. We want to provide the details around what this implementation would look like. So we mentioned the why is to improve mental health outcomes for children and youth, but even further into the system why, implementation and scaling effective cross-system school mental health practices requires examining and adjusting those existing system structures, roles, and functions that keep people stuck. So to create that enabling context of change that can actually move those socially significant outcomes that Cherie was talking about through implementation of science, there's an increase in efficiency. So processes and practices are integrated. Resources are integrated and shared. Cross-system training and teaming to enhance the coordination. We've had teams train together their entire system of staff and do that collaboratively. So increasing efficiency, not going it alone. Aligning with existing district and community improvement efforts. So board goals and system goals, they do complement one another. And when they're aligned, efficiency is increased. So increasing effectiveness happens through just improved collaboration. Relationships, as Cherie said, are the key, and we've seen that over and over again throughout these teams. But making decisions alongside a partner makes a massive difference in when you use data from both systems, from the district and the community. Establishing fidelity and progress monitoring across settings, aligning the evidence and research-based practice. So no longer are we looking at the ideal research that says these are the practices, but actually moving into utilizing research-based practices, establishing a cohesive continuum of support, and really using a self-correcting feedback loop together. And I'll show you a little bit more about how we can make that a little easier, sometimes that elusive self-correcting feedback loop, but we've got a really good way to use that. So ensure sustainability. The purpose is sustainability. But to do so, there needs to be cross-system infrastructure continuity of policies and practices and common language. So often we hear the same conversations happening in different places, but we're using different language, so we never see the connections and are able to use those. So developing plans that address competency and capacity to facilitate implementation. We use district community leadership coaches as a really capacity building capacity. Clearly defining roles and processes for school and community employed mental health providers, not worrying so much about the boundaries or the territorial issues, but defining those roles and processes. So the essential roles for a district community leadership team makes these outcomes possible. District community leadership team members, their participation is extremely important for effective school mental health implementation across district and community partners. So collaborating, planning, coordinating within this district community leadership team includes the executive level leadership with the authority to make those decisions. Ideally, alignment efforts also include other key organizations who are supporting children and youth, foster care, juvenile justice. But we've seen that initially it's more manageable to align processes and practices with one organization first and add additional organizations later on. For our partners, that has mostly included the Regional Community Mental Health Center first, and then expanding to other organizations as some of those processes are established. Initially, district community leadership teams utilize the process components to plan around these specific trauma responsive planning components. So you notice we put trauma responsive at the beginning of these because that is the key to the system. And Sheree shared those core principles. Those core principles are ideally embedded within each of these components and their implementation. For the trauma responsive school community, the school community is trauma informed, but moves beyond that to trauma responsive goals, plans, policies, protocols, processes, practices, and resources. Trauma responsive support planning supports are collaboratively determined and monitored with all relevant stakeholders, including children, youth, and caregivers. So we've seen some amazing successes with this component with our teams that are realizing that cross-system, they have the information they need to support a child or youth. However, alone, they do not. Trauma responsive referral protocol addresses that continuum of mental health supports for children and youth, including referrals to partnering organizations when appropriate. So addressing the need to support children and youth and on a continuum and to collaboratively do so with data is extremely important. So trauma responsive transition and reintegration planning is that final component. The protocol really leads people to understand how a transition from an alternative setting, including a psychiatric residential treatment facility, can be done in a trauma responsive way and how it is necessary for a trauma responsive system. So we've seen children and youth that are dropped in and out of that psychiatric residential treatment facility and only experience more trauma in that transition. So to use these planning components and implement them across a system, we really love the use of these planning components. So these process components. So how is this trauma responsive process and planning? So there are 4 components where we are working through how to implement those planning components in a structured way. So first we consider teaming and planning. So leadership from education and partnering organizations regularly meet to review and address policies, procedures, processes within the school community to improve mental health. Database decision-making includes caregiver engagement data, cross-system data that is used to inform goals, plans, policies, protocols to improve mental health outcomes. Training and coaching, so coaches from education and partnering Organizations collaborate to align and facilitate the implementation of goals, plans, policies, practices, protocols within the school community to improve mental health outcomes. You might notice this trend. So all of these are used to improve mental health outcomes collaboratively. Stakeholder communication, such an important piece. This one deals with how goals and plans and policies and protocols are used to communicate and document with stakeholders, children, youth, and caregivers, those mental health outcomes that we're focused on. So for our next objective, I want to go in a little bit more detail about the application of the school mental health implementation process. So district community leadership teams structure and plan school mental health implementation by systematically using the process components throughout planning. So the process components defined here are teaming and planning still, but we ask some specific questions that prompt district community leadership teams to address these pieces in planning. They're addressed throughout the initial assessment and understanding where the community is currently, as well as what the next steps are for planning. So asking what policies and protocols and resources are in place. Database decision-making, we are wondering, when we're talking through it with teams, it's what data points are being utilized and what could be utilized. Quite often teams are unaware of the data that the other collects. So when considering cross-system database decision-making, what data points are being utilized, but what ones do we actually need to utilize or have available? So in training and coaching, we ask what supports are in place or provided, and which ones are needed and how could they be provided. For stakeholder communication, we ask what is communicated and then what needs to be communicated. So let's take a quick look at the application of these process components as well. So a district community leadership team systematically utilizes the process components to effectively plan for the implementation of cross-system school mental health practices. So we see here that you've got some steps written out. First step is assess, using those process questions that we just discussed. What processes, practices, policies are in place and which ones are needed? What data points are being utilized and could be? What supports are in place and are needed, and what is communicated and needs to be. Developing a SMART goal, very specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound goal is helpful to advance the implementation of the selected component. So when a SMART goal is written, it should be understood by anyone, but it also should move implementation. It should advance implementation, not always to the next phase of implementation, but advance it nonetheless. The third step is developing that action plan. This action plan should achieve the SMART goal, and the action plan is focused around those process components again. So what needed practices or policies or resources will be necessary to achieve that SMART goal? What data points are going to be utilized to make sure that that SMART goal is being met? What's the provision of support to meet that goal, and what needs to be communicated? So revolving back to those process components is extremely important in all parts of planning. Finally, in step 4, DCLT, district community leadership teams actually work on completing those action items, coming back together to review the progress and the progress monitoring and any data that relates to achievement of that SMART goal so that they are able to plan next steps. In addition to facilitating effective implementation, those process components are extremely important to promote that self-correcting feedback loop. We said we'd talk about this a little bit later, which enables the teams to make adjustments as needed. A self-correcting feedback loop is a formal structure that facilitates communication across organizational levels, using those team member roles that we showed you and spoke about. Those implementation teams are able to communicate back through these school mental health processes to provide feedback for reviewing and adjusting school mental health implementation. So extremely important to address barriers and successes to how the implementation was carried out. Next, this implementation science, this is the description of that rubric. So phased implementation is the key here, to effectively guide organizations and system innovations. Implementation science is a strong indicator that you will be able to move forward with the data that Sri shared. We focus on implementation science very heavily. These phases are directly from that. So let's talk a little bit about them. Exploration is that willingness to engage and work together, and it's kind of the beginning of that relationship development. Installation is that commitment. It's evidenced by an agreement to participate with the district community leadership team exemplars that we work with. In initial implementation, district community leadership teams are seeing change evidenced by an initial implementation team, focusing on not the entire population right away, but utilizing that implementation team. Once that initial implementation team provides feedback through that self-correcting feedback loop, district and community are able to work for full implementation, which full implementation is defined as fidelity and outcomes. So moving beyond change to outcomes from a larger population. Fidelity is a focus here in full implementation, which means that teams do not always move through these phases at the same rate, but 50% of the population intended to utilize a practice is progress and promising that sustainability and innovation will be possible. So stopping and working towards fidelity is valuable and worth it, is what our teams have noticed, that because once they're able to see the outcomes and the fidelity actually making that wider spread difference, sustainability and innovation is possible. We know that's the goal, but sustainability and innovation is that regular review and adjustment. So district community leadership teams are able to continue reviewing their data, continually using that self-correcting feedback loop and those process components we talked about, to improve and continue training new staff and making those cohesive decisions as a district community leadership team. So we focus on implementation science because that's where you can see just real change and socially significant outcomes, as Cherie said. So the data collection activities, we mentioned a little bit about data in here. The data collection activities across this district community leadership team are used to inform their work. Our team participating teams share data points to inform the training and coaching provided by state trainers. So here are the data collection activities that we use. All of this sounds like quite a bit of work. And so there's a little bit of a planning schedule and time commitment, as you can imagine, involved in partnering. So as previously noted, effective school mental health implementation across the district and community partners requires high level of collaboration, planning, and coordination. A structured schedule that allows for meaningful planning and time allocated for follow-up activities between meetings, advances, implementation. So district community leadership teams gain experience and progress, and as they progress, they don't need to meet as often. Finally, we want to share with you a few of our resources that have been developed. First and foremost, this top link is the link to our website. You will find a great many resources there. The second link is for our Moodle, an online learning account. And this is a really amazing bunch of resources here that we're excited to share with you. Implementation facilitation guide. So how districts and community leadership teams can implement this together can be found in our Moodle account. So if you can create an account, this implementation facilitation guide has e-learning modules for implementing the school mental health professional development and coaching system, as well as several other amazing resources. And they're all on Moodle because we do value our technology and the ability that it provides for a greater access for everyone. So that's our hope. These trauma responsive school community e-learning modules have been up for about a year, and the implementation facilitation guide has only been up for a little bit, a couple weeks. So we hope that you take a look at those, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you all for joining us so much. Amy, thank you. Realize we have, we could go on talking about this forever, but we are grateful for your interest in improving outcomes, mental health outcomes for children, youth, and our entire school communities, ourselves included. So thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.